I'm going to go on now to a rather more recent case. It's now 1922. And this is about Mr. George Stanley Grimshaw. Mr. Grimshaw was a painter and decorator, and he lived in Walthamstow. He was quite a little chap. He was 54 years old. He was only about 5'1", not much bigger than me. And he was married with 4 children, 3 of whom were grown up and had left home. And so he and his wife and their youngest son were living together quietly. He was a man of routine. He was a painter and decorator. I said he'd do his work, he'd come back home, he'd get some newspapers, some cigarettes, he'd go out for a walk, he'd come home. Very quiet life. And then one day he went out, and a little bit earlier than usual, because he had to go to the dentist to have a fitting for his false teeth. And they were expecting him home that evening, but he never arrived. And the son went out looking for him, couldn't find him anywhere. And then they received some news. Mr. Grimshaw had been found very badly injured in the Hyams Park. Now, Hyams Park, it's about a mile long, about half a mile wide. The River Ching goes through it. There's a big lake, and there's paths with lots of overhanging bushes and trees and things. And he'd been found there. Now, what had happened was, on that evening, a young man had been walking through the park, and he'd seen on the other side of the river a fight going on between 2 men. One of them being Mr. Grimshaw, and the other a tall young man who said, "Clear off, go away, what are you looking at?" So he was a bit puzzled, and eventually he saw the young man and a young woman running off. So he found a place where he could cross the river and went and had a look, and there, lying in a holly bush with his feet sticking out, was this very badly injured man. Another couple found him also and thought maybe he was drunk, but they had a look and there was lots of blood on his head. So they decided to get some medical assistance. Now, because this is 1922 in the middle of Hyams Park. Nowadays, how long would it take him to get into hospital? Well, in 1922, with a combination of people running around looking for park keepers, running for the police, getting a hand ambulance, deciding they wanted something else, etc., etc., it took 2 hours to get it into Whipps Cross Hospital. Well, the wife and daughter hurried to his bedside, and he was in a very bad way. He'd been beaten on the head with something, obviously pretty heavy, and the skull was actually broken up into little pieces. He normally had a purse of money and a 4 watch. They were both missing, and he never regained consciousness, and in fact he died in hospital. So Scotland Yard took charge of the inquiry, and they had a description of the people seen running away, and the Ilford police telephoned to say that there had been 2 people of that description living at a place called Highlands Farm, but the couple never returned. Well, the crime scene was examined. They found a broken umbrella, and there they finally found the murder weapon, which was a spanner, a 10-inch long spanner, stuck into the river and just sticking up vertically with blood on it. Well, George Grimshaw was finally buried in Walthamstow Cemetery, which is a very sad event. His poor wife collapsed at the gravesite. Now, the police were working on the assumption, as I'm sure most people would have been, that this was a random attack, that he'd been simply attacked and robbed. But nobody knew why he had been in the Hyams Park. And then they got information to show that the reason he was in the Hyams Park and the reason why he and his murderer were in the same place at the same time was no accident. And there was rather a lot more to quite inoffensive little George Stanley Grimshaw than anyone had supposed. Leonard Hart was a labourer who worked with Mr. Grimshaw, and previous Easter there'd been a fair, and some of the cottagers had been selling tea. And he'd gone in to have tea, and there at a table was Mr. Grimshaw, with a woman half his age. It was rather embarrassing. Mr. Hart said, "Oh, fancy seeing you here," and left very quickly, and then when they'd met at work the next day, the whole incident was not alluded to. The police discovered that Mr. Grimshaw had been corresponding with a young woman called Elsie Mackenzie, and in fact there'd been an accommodation address somewhere that had kept the letters for them. And they went to this address, and there was a letter from Mr. Grimshaw to the young woman. "My darling girl," he called her, and it became very obvious that there had been a very affectionate relationship between the two, and he had been giving her money. His poor wife had no idea that he had been going out for these walks and meeting another woman, indeed carrying on with another woman. Well, the police traced Elsie's sister, who said that she had recently married a man called Yeldon, and they were at Braintree. So they drove up to Braintree. Initially, they found no sign of them, and they were scouring the whole area. And then someone recalled they'd seen some people at Braintree answering that description, who were in the area of Bocking. And there's a farm at Bocking called Nunnery Farm. And there's actually, in fact, a Franciscan convent quite nearby. And there's a river, Blackwater, running quite close to it. And they found, in fact, when they went up there, that there was Mr. Yeldon, tall, slim young man, and a petite lady, his wife, Elsie. And they'd been living in the outbuildings there. The farm was not occupied. The farmer owned it and kept his pigs there, so he didn't live there. Well, the police first of all said, we're looking into the question of you getting married without proper residence in the area. And they popped them in the police car. And Yeldon said, I know what you've got us for. You've come from the smoke, haven't you? A bit of a giveaway. Yeldon claimed that on the day of the murder he'd been up at his grandfather's farm, which was Highlands Farm, the place, of course, where they had originally been spotted. This was at Ilford. But Elsie had a full statement to make. She said that on the day of the murder she and William had quarrelled, and she had gone off saying that she was going to see her sister, but she was actually going to meet up with Mr. Grimshaw. And she'd met up with Mr. Grimshaw, they'd gone to Hyams Park, and they'd been sitting by the river canoodling, and she thought that Yeldon had followed them there. And she'd been sitting there, they'd been kissing and cuddling, and suddenly Yeldon had rushed up to them with this spanner and started beating Mr. Grimshaw over the head. She was horrified, she wasn't expecting it, she was distressed and all the rest of it, and when that was all finished, she then went through Mr. Grimshaw's pockets and nicked his watch and his purse, so she obviously wasn't that upset. Yeldon made a statement now. He said that he had been overcome with jealousy. He said when he first met Elsie, she'd been earning her living in an immoral way, and he'd been trying to keep her off the streets. And he admitted that he'd followed them to Hyams Park, where he'd seen them kissing, and he'd been so overcome by passion and jealousy that he'd attacked Mr. Grimshaw with this 10-inch spanner, which he just happened to have on his person. His explanation for that was he'd got it for killing chickens. Anyway, it just happened to have it in his pocket. Well, it later transpired that after this event had happened, the couple had rushed off and got married, and they had come for their honeymoon to, guess where? Great Dunmow. That's where they turned up. Yeah, it is the honeymoon capital of Essex, obviously. And they had come to Great Dunmow for their honeymoon, which they had effectively spent on a pub crawl. I don't know how many public houses there are, or were in 1922, but I think they must have visited all of them. The watch, Mr. Grimshaw's watch, had been sold in Panfield to a man who'd been sat outside a shop, and it had been sold eventually. There's a pub called the Panfield Arms. To the landlady there, the police recovered it, and it was identified by Mrs. Grimshaw. And so they then ended up in this barn at Nunnery Farm, Bocking. They had a bit of money left, and they went to the local shop and bought bread and margarine and things like that, and lived off that. The river, they swam in the river. Both of them apparently very good swimmers. Yeldon swam up and down a lot. I don't know what he wore when he was swimming, but Elsie made herself a swimming costume from 2 handkerchiefs tied together. Now, I don't quite know what that would have looked like, but I'm quite sure that in 1922 a woman's bathing costume was rather more substantial than 2 handkerchiefs, and it caused a bit of excitement in the area. People noticed it, but they did say they thought that it was a young couple who were going to live the simple life. That's what they thought. The representative of the Essex Chronicle said about Nunnery Farm, a more lonely place could hardly be found so near to habitation. Well, their stolen money ran out. Elsie sold her wedding ring to buy food. Their food had run out. At the time of their arrest, they had no money, no food, nothing to sell. They're a pretty bad way. They were eventually identified by the people who'd seen them running away as the people involved in the murder. There wasn't any problem about that. And the spanner belonged to Yeldon's grandfather. However, was this story of Yeldon following Elsie true? Was that all chance? The police didn't think so. The police thought that this was actually a conspiracy. That Elsie knew that Grimshaw carried money with him, and in fact Grimshaw's wife always said that he carried a lot of money with him in the purse, and she'd been begging him to put it in the bank and he'd been refusing. So she knew he had money. Had this been a conspiracy, had she lured him to that lonely spot in Hyams Park, in the bushes, and there Yeldon had been lying in wait with this handy spanner and killed him. Was she as guilty as he? Both of them were ultimately charged with willful murder. They both had a record of petty crime. Yeldon, in fact, was a deserter from the Navy. Elsie had worked in domestic service, but more lately had been making her living from casual prostitution. So when they'd met, and Yeldon decided he was going to save her from this terrible life, and he wasn't very good at it, he went out and stole a bicycle and was instantly caught and ended up in jail for 6 months. And then they were reunited soon afterwards, and but Elsie used to go out saying she was going to see her sister, and she'd come back with money. Yeah, he was pretty sure how she was getting it. When they first appeared in court, it was found, of course, that Elsie, having only one outfit to wear, was wearing the same outfit she'd worn at the murder, which was still covered in blood. And so they had to rush out quickly and buy another outfit so she could wear it in court, and so the one she was wearing could be given in as evidence. At the trial, it was found that she had no legal representation. I mean, the trial opened, she had no lawyer, so they had to quickly ask Yeldon's lawyer to represent her. The prosecution obviously said that they conspired. Yeldon's defence was that he'd been provoked. He now claimed, this is a really good one, he claimed, now Yeldon was 23 and about nearly 6 foot tall, and Mr. Grimshaw was about not much bigger than me and 54 years old. Yeldon was now saying that Mr. Grimshaw had provoked everything. He'd attacked him, he'd got the spanner off him and attacked him with it, and he'd somehow knocked it out of his, and all that sort of stuff, you know, it was absolute rubbish. The judge summed it up. He said, Yeldon's story of the fight was a little difficult to believe. That's his quote. And the idea of provocation, he said, no, this is the judge's words, it could hardly be considered provocation to find a man having improper relationships with a woman of this character. Well, the jury was only absent for 20 minutes, and they were both found guilty. The judge said, do you have any recommendations for mercy? No. Both of them were sentenced to death. She promptly fainted, of course. And they were actually allowed to write to each other in their respective prisons, which quite surprised me. Often that doesn't happen. Well, the appeals were dismissed, but ultimately Elsie was pardoned and her sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. Yeldon was hanged. I discovered, when I got all the papers out of the National Archives, that she actually was a model prisoner, very well behaved, and she did very well. And she was freed on licence. It was in 1931. There was a sort of aftercare service where she was freed. And I did a bit more digging, and I believe she actually married and had a child. But I'm not giving too many details about that, because somebody somewhere doesn't want to be surprised by finding out that they're her son. And she in fact lived to a ripe old age. She died many years later. She was nearly 90 years old. As far as I know, she didn't commit any more crimes.